This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Baruchim haba and welcome everyone to a special edition of All Parsha on Parshas Vayeishev, the Ramban on Parshas Vayeishev. In the middle of the Parsha, we encounter a very enigmatic, mystical episode of the foundation and the roots of the Malchus Beis David through Yehuda, who marries Bashua, and he has two children, Er and Oinon, and Er dies, and Yehuda tells Oinon, in Perek Lamed Ches Pasuk Ches, Yemer Yehuda LaOinon Boi El Eshes Achicha V'Yabeim Oisa V'Hakim Zera LeAchicha. Be Miyabim, the levirate marriage, and establish seed for your brother. So this is our first encounter with the mitzvah of Yibum. Actually now Daf HaShavua is learning Masechta Yevamos, and the mitzvah of Yibum is always interesting to me. Amazingly, of all the Masechtos in Seder Nashim, Rabbi begins Seder Nashim with Yevamos. Yevamos. Doesn't Kedushin come first? Ksubais. Yibum is a very rare situation. Interestingly, the Sefer Masir Rekech, Rabbi Lezer of Amsterdam, he brings that because Rabbi composed and compiled the Mishnah, and he was a scion of the Malchus Beis David, and he realized Malchus Beis David was based on and built on Yibum, as we find in here, in Parshas Vayeishev, and Rosen Bayaz. Therefore, Rabbi began Seder Nashim with Yevamos, because that's the very foundation of the Davidic dynasty. And here the Ramban takes the opportunity to explain, to some extent, the mitzvah of Yibum, the concept behind Yibum. He begins by quoting Rashi. What does it mean? V'hakim zera la'achicha. Rashi says, Haben yikra al shem hames. The son will be called by the name of the mess. In other words, Oinon would marry Tamar, and they would have a child, and the child's name would be Er, named after the deceased. The Ramban asks, Vein ze emes, it's not true. Ki b'mitzvah haTorah nemar gam kein Yaakov al shem achiv hames. In Kiseitze, when it talks about the mitzvah of Yibum, it also says Yaakov al shem achiv hames. V'lo yimachesh shmai b'Yisrael, and his name will not be erased from the Jewish people. Ve'ein hayava mitzuva likroi livnai kishem achiv hames, and there's no commandment that the Yavam call his son's name like the name of the deceased. There's no such mitzvah. You don't have to call the child born from that union after the deceased. V'amar b'Boyaz, it says when Boyaz was miyabim Rus, v'gam es Rus hamoyu aviyah, eshes machlain, kanisi li isha, Rus, the Moabite, the wife of Machlon, I acquired as a wife, l'hakim shem hamesan nachlasai, v'lo yikarei shem hames mim echav, and so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers, u'mishar mekaymai. And what they call him? They called him Oived. What do you mean they called him Oived? Don't you have to call the child Machloin? That was the name of the deceased, Loi Machloin. So we see clearly there is no such command to call the child of the product of Yibum after the deceased. Va'oid, furthermore, Oinon did not want to do Yibum. Va'oid sha'amar, Oinon said, Vayeda Oinon knew, ki lo yiyah hazar, that the child, the seed, would not be his, and therefore he spilled the seed to the ground, and he did not want to impregnate the wife of Er. What was the issue? What bad would have come to him to have to name the child after the deceased brother? Adki hishchazar mi panea, that he had to destroy, he had to ruin the seed. Im yikar shem benoy kshem achav hames. So why did it trouble Oinon so deeply that he was mashchas zaroi, that he destroyed his seed? He did not try to impregnate the woman because the child would have to be named after his brother? What's wrong with that? Most people want to name after the deceased. But the Ramban says the pasuk doesn't say that Oinon said that lo yiyah hazara, that the child would not be his. V'lo amar hakosov vayomer Oinon. The pasuk doesn't say Oinon said. Aval Omar, the pasuk says, Vayeda Oinon. Oinon realized, Ki lo yeh hazara. Ki yedia brura hoisaloi bezeh shelo yeh lo hazara. He had some kind of definitive knowledge that the child would not be his. What exactly was this definitive knowledge? And very interesting, the Ramban does not really reveal to us the full secret of Yibam. But the Ramban says, Aval Inyan, this subject, Soid Gadol, is a great secret, Misoidois HaTorah, of the secrets of the Torah, B'Toiledas HaAdam, in the creation of man. And it's something that someone who has spiritual sensitive eyes could be attuned to. V'nikar hu la'inei roim, it's recognizable to the eyes of onlookers, asher nasal lahem Hashem einayim, who God has given eyes, lirois to see v'oznayim l'shmaya. Namely, v'hayu ha'chachamim ha'kadmoinim koidim ha'torah yoidim, the sages, the wise man before the Torah was given, knew, ki yesh toy elas gedoyla b'yibam ha'ach, that there was great benefit in the yibam to a brother. V'hu ha'roi liyos koidem bai, and that he is the one who should have precedence to perform this mitzvah. V'achrav ha'karav b'mishpach, and after him, the closest relative. Ki kol she'iroi ha'karav elav mimishpachtai, any relative that is close from the family, asher hu yorish nachala, who would be an inheritor, yagia mimenu toyelas, benefit would accrue from such a union. And the Ramban does not explain this fully, and he only alludes to it minimally, but the Malbim in Kiseitze says outright that the concept of Yibum is that the soul of the deceased is hovering. The soul of the deceased, because it did not produce children, is in flux, in turmoil. It needs a body to be contained within. And when the Yavam, when his relative marries his wife, the wife of the deceased, and they produce a child, that child will be the container, the body to house the soul of the deceased. So the child is not his in the sense that, in effect, it is not the child of the Yavam, but rather this is the deceased, and this person is the child of his former parents. So he doesn't belong to the brother who did Yibam, he belongs to his original father and mother. And this is what the Malbim says, the secret of the mitzvah of Yibam, alluded to in Megillas Rus. The Malbim says that when the Malbim explains in Megillas Rus that when Boaz married Rus and they had a child Oived, the people said, Yulad ben Naomi, a child was born to Naomi, not to Boaz, but to Naomi, because this was in fact Machloin, and does not, this child does not belong to Boaz. Now, the body for the soul is like a shoe to the body. The analogy is the shoe doesn't contain the body. The shoe just houses the lowest part of the body. So too, the body does not contain the soul. The body just is the shoe for the soul, for the lowest part of the soul. The most of the soul is up in the shamayim, in the oilamos v'alyonim, and only the lowest part of the soul trickles down into the guf. So, when the Yavam does not want to perform the mitzvah of Yibam and basically give a body to his brother, so he doesn't want to give a shoe to the soul of the deceased, so we remove his shoe. That's the concept of chalitza. This is how the Malbim explains the concept of chalitza. The Ramban continues, the custom was lisa eishas hames ha'ach, that the brother would marry the wife of the deceased, oy ha'av, or the father would marry the wife of the deceased, oy ha'karev min ha'mishpacha. Says Ramban, v'lo yadanu, we don't really know him, ha'yaminag kadman lefnei Yehuda, if this minhag predated Yehuda. Ubereshis Rabbah, the Medrash tells us, Amru ki Yehuda hischum mitzvah yibam tchila, Yehuda originated the mitzvah of Yibam. Ki kasher kibal asad me'avayisav, because he received the secret and the tradition of Yibam from his forefathers, nizdarei zahakam oisai, he was energetic to fulfill it. V'chasher basa ha-Torah, when the Torah came, v'asra eishes ktsas ha-kroivim, and it prohibited the wife of some relatives, so now this would prohibit many forms of Yibam. A father could not marry the wife of the deceased. One cannot marry his son's wife. So, but the Rebbeinu Shalom still wanted Yibam to apply where it would fulfill the greatest benefit, and therefore, v'chasher basa haTorah, when the Torah came, ba'asra ishes ksasakrim, and they forbid the wife of some relatives. Ratzah Kodesh Baruch Hu lahater isra ishes ha'ach. The Rebbeinu Shalom wanted to permit the prohibition of the wife of a brother, mibnei hayibam. He did not want to push away from the mitzvah of Yibam the prohibition of the wife of the father's brother or the wife of a son. Only the wife of a brother. Why? What's more significant about the wife of a brother? Firstly, it had already become customary to marry the wife of one's brother. And v'tayelas kroiva, and it had a more close and direct benefit. V'loi bohem, and not by the other relatives. K'maishe hizkarti. Now, if the brother did not want to fulfill the mitzvah of Yibam, which we explained means he did not want to provide a body for the soul of the deceased that's in flux, nechshav la'achzarius gedol, that was considered great cruelty. Be'ach, to the brother, if you didn't want to do Yibam, we call such a person Beis Chalutz Hanoal, the house of the removal of the shoe. Because now the soul of the deceased is completely removed from them. V'roi, it is fitting that this mitzvah is performed in the removal of the shoe. Why it's fitting, the Ramban doesn't explain. We explained the exposition of the Malbim. The Chachmei Yisrael HaKadmonim, the sages of the earliest generations, they understood on their own the benefit of this practice. So this was because they understood the benefit of this practice. In Higu L'fanim Yisrael, they made it customary in the early generations in the Jewish people to perform this act b'chol yorshei hanachala, by any inheritors of nachala, provided that there was no isser of relative. Like we find by Boaz and Rus. Even though Boaz was not the brother-in-law of Rus, but he was not asr to her, she was not an erva to him, and therefore they continued to adopt this practice, and this practice was deemed v'karu isai geula, this was redemption. V'zehu inyan Boaz, this is the concept of what Boaz did to Rus. Boaz was giving a body to the soul of Machloin that was in flux, and this was the concept of what Nami advised Rus, V'hashchenos, and the neighbors, who they said, Yulad ben Lenami. As we explained, Oived was not technically the child of Boaz. He was the child of Nami, V'hamaskil Yavin. One who is wise will understand this to an even deeper level. So this is Ramban's approach to the mitzvah of Yibam. Not that the child that's created through Yibam is named after the deceased, but rather that child is in effect considered the very soul of the deceased themselves, and therefore Oinon did not want to produce a child that this child would not be his seed. This child would belong to Yehuda, and therefore he wasn't willing to participate in such an activity. And this is the Ramban's approach to the mitzvah of Yibam. Wishing everyone a wonderful rest of the week. Shabbos, Mevarchim, Chodesh, Kislev, Haba Alinu L'Taiva.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.